I pulled into that park in a car worth more than my entire family's combined life savings, and the first thing I saw was my mother's face collapsing in real time. Not because she was happy to see me, because she recognized me. 7 years earlier, that same woman had looked me dead in the eye and told me the man I loved was never meant for me anyway. My own sister had stood in my kitchen and let my fiancé believe I'd been cheating on him, using texts she wrote herself, on a phone that wasn't mine, about a man who never existed. And when the truth cracked open, when I finally understood what had actually happened to me, I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I packed one bag, dropped my phone into a river, and vanished so completely that for 5 years, I was a ghost story people whispered about at Thanksgiving. But ghosts come back. And sometimes, when they do, they're driving something with a six-figure price tag and a smile that doesn't reach their eyes. This is the story of how I disappeared with nothing and came home with everything. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why revenge, when you're patient enough, doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be inevitable. My name doesn't matter yet. Just call me the daughter nobody bet on. Let me take you back. Not to the day everything blew up, to the years before, because you can't understand why I walked away so easily unless you understand that I'd been practicing my whole life. I was raised in a town so small that gossip traveled faster than the mail truck. The kind of place where your last name followed you into every classroom, every church pew, every grocery store checkout line. And in my house, there were 2 daughters, and only one of them was ever allowed to actually take up space. My older sister, 2 years ahead of me in school, light years ahead of me in my mother's affection, was the kind of girl teachers wrote glowing letters about. Cheer captain. Student council. The homecoming photos, the yearbook superlatives, the whole shining package. She didn't just walk into a room, she filled it, and everyone let her. Me? I was the quiet one. The gifted one, if you wanted to be polite about it, which nobody in my family particularly wanted to be. I got good grades. I read too much. I noticed everything and said almost nothing, because early on I learned that saying something in that house rarely worked out in my favor. I still remember the night that taught me the rule of our household better than anything else ever could. I'd come home with a report card that was, academically, close to perfect, a high mark in an advanced math class I'd fought to get into, the kind of grade that should have earned at least a raised eyebrow. My mother looked at it for maybe 2 seconds, handed it back, told me to spend less time cooped up in my room. That same afternoon, my sister brought home AC in a class she'd barely tried in, and my mother took her out for a celebratory Sunday because, and I'm quoting her exact reasoning here, she's under so much social pressure, poor thing. I was 11 years old, sitting on the stairs, doing the math on that one all by myself. And the math never changed for the next decade. Even the architecture of our house told the story. Her bedroom was the big corner, one soft pink walls, a canopy bed, a closet the size of my entire room. Mine was the leftover space at the end of the hallway, the one that faced the neighbor's garbage cans, freezing in January and an oven in July. I once asked, very quietly, if I could maybe paint my walls a different color. My mother's response was that I shouldn't make a fuss over something so trivial. My father wasn't cruel. He was just absent in the way exhausted, conflict-avoidant men often are. He worked long hours in logistics, came home tired, and had apparently decided a long time before I was born that peace in the house was worth more than fairness in the house. I remember him catching me crying in the hallway once, after another blow-up where my mother had, predictably, taken my sister's side of an argument that wasn't even close to fair. He didn't defend me. He just looked at me with tired eyes and told me to keep my head down, that it was easier that way. He wasn't trying to hurt me. That was genuinely the only survival strategy he had to offer. So I adapted. I got smaller, quieter. I stopped announcing my wins because wins made other people in that house uncomfortable, and I started apologizing for feelings that were, by any normal measuring stick, completely reasonable. I told myself I loved my sister, and some blurry, complicated part of me probably did, but underneath that, I was just a kid who'd been trained to accept the supporting role in somebody else's story. What I didn't understand back then, what I wouldn't understand for years, was that being handed the spotlight for 18 straight years doesn't satisfy a person like that. It starves them. It teaches them that any attention pointed anywhere else is attention stolen from them. And eventually, that hunger finds a target. It found me, and it very nearly cost me everything. If you've ever been the other child in a family that only had room for 1 star, you already know exactly the kind of storm I'm about to walk you into. Stay with me, it gets so much worse before it gets better. Here's the thing nobody tells you about spending your whole childhood invisible. When someone finally sees you, really sees you, it hits different. It's disorienting. Almost too much to process. That's exactly what happened the year I met him. I'll call him by the name I gave him in my head for years afterward, my anchor. We met in the least dramatic way imaginable, a cramped little coffee shop near my college campus, mismatched furniture, bad art on the walls, the kind of place you go to cram for finals and end up doing anything but studying. I dropped a pen. It rolled under the next table. He was sketching something in a battered notebook, a few years older than me, working as a junior architect at a small local firm. He handed the pen back with this easy, warm smile, and something in that dingy little room just lit up. We talked for 3 hours straight. Didn't run out of things to say once. What made him different wasn't grand gestures. We didn't really do those. It was the small stuff. The way he actually listened, not just to my words, but to the pauses between them, like he was tracking the parts one was too scared to say out loud. When I was drowning in stress over a work presentation, he stayed up with me past midnight, not just for company, but actually helping me think it through, asking real questions, genuinely curious about the boring logistics I was panicking over. He was the first person in my entire adult life who heard an idea of mine. I used to ramble about a business concept I was dreaming up, and instead of changing the subject, he leaned in and said I could actually build that. Nobody had ever said something like that to me and meant it. For the first time in my life, I felt seen instead of tolerated. Bringing him home was like dropping a stranger into a closed ecosystem that didn't know what to do with an outsider. My mother spent our first family dinner interrogating him about his salary potential with a smile that never once reached her eyes. My sister was worse, in a quieter, more surgical way, sweet on the surface, ice underneath. She told him, in front of everyone, how lucky I was to have found someone so calm to balance out how intense I apparently was. A compliment wrapped around a blade. I told myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't. Looking back now, with everything I know, I can tell you exactly what that look in her eyes actually was. It wasn't sisterly curiosity. It was a predator cataloging something she'd already decided belonged to her. The first real fracture happened at my own college graduation dinner, a night that was, on paper, supposed to be about me. My parents had booked a nice table. My father gave a short, sweet toast. Then my mother nudged my sister to say a few words. She stood, raised her glass, opened with something about how proud she was of her little sister, and within 4 sentences had somehow pivoted the entire toast into a highlight reel of her own college years, her own presidency, her own supposedly grueling schedule of charity work and social obligations. She capped it off with a joke about how I'd failed my driver's test the first time, and the table laughed right on cue. Everyone laughed. Except him. Under the table, his hand found mine and squeezed once, a silent little signal that said, I see exactly what's happening here, and I'm not going anywhere. I told myself it was just typical older sister behavior. But it stung worse than usual, watching her steal the one night that was supposed to belong to me, in front of the one person who actually valued what I'd accomplished. Not long after we moved in together, things got stranger. One evening while we were cooking dinner, he showed me his phone with this puzzled expression on his face. My sister had texted him, completely unprompted, something about spotting a stranger wearing a cologne that reminded her of him. A cologne I'd mentioned to her exactly once, months earlier, in passing. He laughed it off as her just being weirdly friendly. I didn't laugh. Something cold settled into my stomach that night and never fully left. From there, it escalated in small, deniable increments, the kind of thing that sounds crazy when you say it out loud, but feels suffocating when you're living inside it. A hand lingering too long on his arm during a laugh. Inside jokes from their childhood, dragged out specifically when I was in earshot, engineered to remind me I wasn't part of that history. Family game nights that always somehow paired the two of them on a team while my father and I got shuffled off together, my mother cheering loudest for the team I wasn't on. One night, driving home from one of these gatherings, he went quiet. When I finally asked what was wrong, he admitted, almost apologetically, that my sister had been telling him things that we used to fight constantly, that I could apparently be difficult when I didn't get my way. She wasn't just flirting with the edges of a line. She was quietly building a case against me, one poisoned little detail at a time, planting it directly into the mind of the person I trusted most. And here's the part that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. I noticed all of it. Every single warning sign. And I still had absolutely no idea how far she was actually willing to go. Despite every uneasy feeling, I was still completely, stupidly in love. I knew, with the kind of certainty you only get once or twice in a lifetime, that I wanted to marry him. I'd been quietly setting aside money from every paycheck for months, saving toward exactly one thing, a ring. Nothing flashy. A vintage sapphire, small, elegant, surrounded by a delicate ring of tiny diamonds. It felt like us. Understated but permanent. I planned a whole weekend getaway to seal the deal, a little cabin in the mountains I'd found online, complete with a fireplace and a view of more stars than I'd ever seen at once. The ring was hidden in my suitcase. I'd rehearsed the words in my head 100 times. I had our entire future mapped out in perfect, romantic detail. The night before we were supposed to leave, I was folding a sweater into my suitcase when I noticed he'd been sitting on the edge of the bed for several minutes, completely silent, just watching me. Something in his face told me the ground was about to disappear beneath me. "I don't think I can do this," he said, so quietly I almost missed it. I thought he meant the trip. I offered to reschedule. He shook his head. "Not the trip," he said. "Us." I remember the word not even registering as language at first. It just landed like a physical blow, knocking the air straight out of me. We'd been planning dinner for the following week. This made no sense. Then he said it. "I know about the other guy, Audrey." There was no other guy. There had never been another guy. I told him that, over and over, my voice climbing toward panic. He wouldn't look at me. He said my sister had shown him texts, messages supposedly sent from my phone to a coworker, admitting I was bored, that I felt trapped in the relationship. He said she'd been crying when she showed him, that she hadn't wanted to be the one to break it to him but couldn't stand watching him get played for a fool. I demanded to see the texts. "Show me. Right now." He couldn't. She deleted them from her own phone immediately after showing him, claiming she didn't want that filth sitting on her device. According to her story, she'd confronted me directly, and I'd broken down and confessed everything, begging her not to say anything. Do you understand how perfect that lie was? She built an entire narrative, manufactured evidence just real enough to be convincing, showed it to exactly one person, and then destroyed it before anyone else could verify a single word. It left me with nothing to fight back with except my own voice against the voice of the sister everyone had already decided was the trustworthy one. I begged him to look at me. To really look at me and tell me he believed a total fabrication over 7 years of knowing who I actually was. He flinched away from my hand like I'd become something dangerous. His silence answered the question I never should have had to ask. A week later, I came home from work to an empty apartment and a single key left on the kitchen counter. That night, my mother called, not to comfort me, not to ask what had actually happened, but to deliver one final twist of the knife in the calmest voice imaginable. "You'll be okay, sweetie," she said. "He was never meant for you anyway." I want you to sit with that line for a second, because I certainly have for years. My own mother didn't ask a single question about whether the accusation was even true. She just accepted it, filed it away, and moved on like I was a minor inconvenience that had finally resolved itself. The 3 months after that call are honestly a blur even now. I existed rather than lived. I went to work on autopilot, came home to an apartment that felt like a museum exhibit of a life that no longer belonged to me, ate food I couldn't taste, slept without ever actually resting. I called him more times than I'm proud to admit. Texted long, desperate messages that sat there unread. It was like he'd been erased. The final blow arrived on an ordinary Tuesday night, delivered through a text from an old college friend. "Hey, you seeing this?" Attached was a screenshot and engagement announcement. A park full of golden autumn leaves. Him, smiling in a way that somehow didn't quite reach his eyes. And beside him, beaming, hand resting possessively on his chest, was my sister. Flashing my ring. The exact vintage sapphire I'd handpicked, still, I thought, hidden safely in the back of my closet, waiting for a proposal that was never going to happen now. She hadn't just taken my fiancé. She'd taken the literal ring meant for our engagement. My whole future, repackaged and handed to her like she'd ordered it off a shelf. I stared at that photo for what felt like an hour, waiting to finally break down completely. Instead, something strange happened. I laughed. Not a happy sound. A small, hollow, brittle laugh that echoed through an apartment that suddenly felt enormous and empty. It was the laugh of someone who has officially hit the bottom of the well and realizes there's nowhere left to go but straight back up. That same night, I packed one bag. Not everything, just the essentials. I walked through our apartment one final time like a stranger touring somebody else's memories. Left his favorite mug sitting on the counter. Left our photos exactly where they were on the shelf. Took one last look and walked out without turning back. I emailed my boss and quit on the spot. Mailed my landlord a check covering 2 months' rent to break my lease clean. Withdrew what little savings I had left from an ATM. bought a cheap burner phone at an electronics store. Then I drove to the edge of town, took my smartphone out of its case, and threw it into a river, watching it sink and take every digital thread connecting me to my old life down with it. I deleted every social account I had. And then, quite simply, I disappeared. I had no plan. No destination. Just a used sedan, a tank of gas, and a rage burning so cold and so deep in my chest that it felt less like an emotion and more like fuel. And it turns out, that's exactly what it became. For 2 years, I lived like a nomad, chasing nothing in particular, just putting distance between myself and everything I used to be. I mixed drinks behind a bar in a city known for its live music, learning the exact science of a proper old-fashioned. I pulled espresso shots in a hipster coffee shop somewhere with mountain views. I hauled suitcases as a bellhop at a ski lodge for guests wealthier than anything I'd ever imagined, watching them tip more for one bag than I used to make in a day. I lived out of cheap motels and rented rooms, profoundly and achingly alone. But something strange happens in that kind of solitude, if you let it. Instead of numbing yourself scrolling through other people's curated lives, I started building my own quietly in notebooks, late at night. Business ideas. Half-formed sketches of software concepts. One idea in particular kept resurfacing, something built around streamlining logistics, a concept I'd first started dreaming up back in college. I taught myself to code from free tutorials, camping out in public libraries for hours at a stretch. I lived on instant noodles and gas station coffee, saving every spare cent with an almost religious discipline. Bitterness, when it's aimed correctly, turns out to be one of the most efficient fuels a person can run on. 3 years after that, I found the partner who would change everything, a sharp programmer I connected with online who believed in the same vision I did. We pooled what little we had, worked absurd 18-hour days, and eventually launched the company together. The first year nearly broke us. We came within a hair of bankruptcy twice. But then we landed our first serious client. Then another. Then the growth started compounding on itself, slow at first, and then like a wildfire catching wind. By the time I turned 28, 5 years after I'd vanished, I wasn't just doing okay. I was quietly, privately, seriously wealthy. I had a home on a lake outside a major West Coast city, a life I'd built with my own 2 hands out of absolutely nothing but stubbornness and rage. And that, of course, was exactly the moment the past finally caught my scent. It started with an email to an old college address I hadn't checked in years, one I'd kept purely out of sentiment. Subject line, family reunion, we miss you. Sender, Mom. My hands actually trembled opening it. The tone inside was sickeningly cheerful, written like I'd simply been on an extended vacation instead of gone for 5 years without a word. Chatty updates about cousins I hadn't thought about since childhood. And then, buried in the middle, the line that turned my stomach. She wrote that my sister and her husband would be there with their little one, that I now had a nephew, and that the family picture just wouldn't be complete without me there. I deleted it without a reply. But apparently that was enough. Like they'd picked up my scent again. A few weeks later, my business partner forwarded me an oddly aggressive email from someone claiming to be a potential investor, pushing hard for a direct, private meeting. Something about the phrasing felt off, too familiar. I had our tech team trace the address. It routed back to a public library IP in my old hometown. My sister, pretending to be an investor just to get a direct line to me. Pathetic and, honestly, a little chilling. That's when I called an old college roommate who'd stayed in the area, one of the very few people I'd kept even loose contact with. After some catching up, I casually asked if he'd heard anything about my sister lately. What he told me over the next few minutes rearranged everything I thought I knew. She was drowning in debt. She'd apparently burned through inheritance money trying to launch some kind of failed influencer brand. Her family was underwater on their mortgage. Her husband's car had recently been repossessed, and word was he was already threatening divorce. And the kicker, they'd moved back in with my parents months earlier. Right back into the nest that had always cushioned her falls. My mother, meanwhile, was apparently still spinning the same tired narrative to anyone who'd listen, that my sister was just going through a rough patch, that her husband was simply being difficult. Nothing had changed. The golden child was still golden, no matter what evidence piled up against her. And me? Still the family ghost. Until I decided, very deliberately, not to be. The reunion was scheduled at a rented picnic pavilion in a public park, the exact kind of event my mother lived for, an opportunity for maximum social peacocking. I knew immediately I had to go. Not for them. For me. The weeks leading up to it were oddly calm, almost meditative. The blistering rage I'd carried for years had cooled into something colder and far more precise. This wasn't about a public meltdown anymore. This was about closing a chapter with intention. I went shopping, but I didn't buy a dress off a rack. I commissioned a tailored suit from a boutique designer, dark and sharp, the kind of outfit that doesn't need to shout to command a room. For the day itself, I rented a sleek black luxury sedan, a genuinely obscene amount of money for a single day, but the price was never the point. The point was the statement it made the second it rolled through the entrance. It was armor. Plain and simple. I booked a suite at a hotel 2 towns over, drove down the evening before, and barely slept. I just stood at the window most of that night, staring out at the distant lights of the town that had once discarded me without a second thought, and I felt, for the first time in years, completely ready. I had no idea, standing at that window, just how spectacularly their day was about to fall apart before mine even really began. I arrived 10 minutes early. The park was already filling up with distant relatives, kids weaving between picnic tables, that familiar hum of forced cheerful family chatter. I rolled the sedan slowly past the entrance and parked it in the most visible spot available, directly in the sight line of the main pavilion. I stepped out, took a slow, deliberate second to straighten my jacket, and walked in like I belonged exactly where I was standing. Nobody recognized me right away. My hair was different. My clothes were different. But more than any of that, the way I carried myself had completely changed. I wasn't gliding along the walls trying to disappear anymore. I walked with purpose, straight past the confused-looking welcome table, and calmly poured myself a glass of iced tea like I hadn't just detonated an entire family's sense of normalcy. Then I heard the gasp. My aunt's voice cut through the crowd first, disbelieving, and within seconds whispers were rippling outward like a current. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. I kept my expression neutral, gave a small polite nod, and kept walking until I found them, my mother frozen mid-bite of potato salad, my sister's face twisting from shock into something uglier, and, beside them, holding a small boy's hand, the man I'd once planned an entire future with. He looked older, wearier. He was staring at me like I'd walked straight out of a memory he'd tried to bury. Right then, my mother's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her expression soured instantly. I overheard her mutter to my aunt that my sister's car had broken down 2 blocks away. I glanced back toward the gleaming black car I'd parked at the entrance and took another slow sip of my tea. Every single eye in that park was on me now. And for the first time in my entire life, I didn't shrink under the weight of that attention. I let it land. I waited for the show to start. A few minutes later, a battered old minivan came sputtering into view like it had personally survived a war zone, and things were about to get a lot more interesting. The minivan lurched to a stop with one final, rattling groan of the engine. My sister climbed out, flustered, furious, slamming the door hard behind her. Her eyes swept the crowd and landed on me almost instantly. Whatever confidence she usually wore like a second skin was gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered shock. The rest of the afternoon crawled forward in waves of unbearable tension. Distant cousins offered half-hearted hugs, their eyes full of questions they were too polite to actually ask out loud. My mother tried valiantly to project normalcy, her voice climbing an octave higher than usual as she welcomed me like I'd simply been away at summer camp. Then came the toasts. My mother stood first, tapping her fork against her wine glass, a rehearsed smile sliding into place. She thanked everyone for coming, called it a miracle to have the whole family back together, then pivoted into praising my sister's supposed strength through a challenging year, as if the challenges hadn't been entirely self-inflicted. She mentioned me almost as an afterthought, framing my return as some quirky surprise rather than the reckoning it actually was. My sister followed with her own short, clearly rehearsed speech about the sacred importance of family, glancing my way with an expression meant to look conciliatory but landing somewhere much closer to malice. I stayed seated through both. I didn't clap once. And then something happened that I genuinely did not see coming. He stood up. Still holding his son's hand, he walked to the front of the gathering. His face was pale, but his voice, when it came, was steady in a way I hadn't heard from him in years. I wasn't going to say anything, he began. But since we're all being honest today. My sister's head snapped toward him. Don't, she said sharply. He held up a hand and kept going anyway. No. You've had your turn. The entire park went dead silent. He told them everything. That the story they'd all believed for years, the cheating, the abandonment, had never been true. That my sister had fabricated the whole thing, manufactured fake messages, built an entire false narrative designed to convince him I was going to leave him for someone else, deliberately targeting every insecurity he had until he broke. His voice cracked as he admitted he'd believed her because he was young, scared, and it had simply been easier than confronting his own doubts. He turned toward my sister, calling out exactly what she'd actually done, not just told a lie, but destroyed something real just to take what belonged to someone else. Then he turned to my mother and told her plainly that she'd encouraged it, sold him a story she knew wasn't true. Finally, his eyes found mine, thick with the regret I could feel from across the lawn. He apologized. Said he knew it was too late, that he didn't expect forgiveness, but that he needed me to hear the truth from his own mouth. Then he took his son's hand and walked straight past my mother and my sister, disappearing into the stunned crowd without another word. You could have heard a single leaf hit the ground in that silence. And I hadn't even opened my mouth yet. No one clapped after he walked away. No one moved. The silence sat there, heavy, thick with the weight of a truth that had just detonated in the middle of what was supposed to be a pleasant family gathering. My sister stood frozen, her face a mixture of fury and public humiliation. My mother sank into her chair, looking, for the very first time in my memory, genuinely small. I stood up slowly and walked through the stunned crowd to the small portable microphone, still set up for toasts. It was still warm from his hand. I looked out over rows of familiar faces, the same relatives who'd laughed along at my sister's jokes at my expense for years, who'd nodded politely when my mother called me too sensitive, who'd let me disappear without a single phone call, and who'd only rediscovered my email address once word got around that I'd become successful. They stared back at me, waiting. I gave them neither a meltdown nor an apology. "I'm not here to clear my name," I said, my voice steady. A ripple of discomfort moved through the tables. That would assume I still cared what any of you thought. I let that hang in the air a moment, scanning the crowd, making eye contact with aunts, uncles, cousins who'd all played their small part in the silence. I just wanted to see, I continued, whether anything had actually changed in 5 years. It hasn't. You still cheer loudest for whoever's the most convincing performer in the room. You still protect whoever makes you the most comfortable. And you still mistake performance for character. My voice stayed level, but my hands were shaking slightly, not from anger anymore, but from something closer to release. Like a weight I'd been carrying my entire life was finally, physically lifting off my shoulders. I used to think I just wasn't good enough for this family, I said, looking between my mother's pale face and my sister's trembling one. Turns out I was just too honest for it. I set the microphone down gently, no dramatic slam, no need for one, and walked away. I didn't wait to see their reactions. I didn't need to anymore. I walked through the silent crowd with my head up, climbed into that gleaming car, closed the heavy door on years of noise and judgment, and finally exhaled a breath I felt like I'd been holding since I was 11 years old on those stairs. But here's the thing about closure, sometimes it isn't actually the end. Sometimes it's just the door swinging open on something much bigger. And I was about to walk straight through it. Back in the quiet of my hotel suite that night, the adrenaline faded and left behind a strange, ringing clarity. Hearing him finally say the truth out loud in front of everyone had been validating, like a pressure valve finally releasing after years of built-up strain. But as I paced that hotel room, a different feeling started creeping in. It wasn't enough. Because this hadn't just been a moment of jealous cruelty. It had been a calculated, sustained campaign. And I needed to know exactly how far it actually went. The next morning, instead of driving home, I stayed. I opened my laptop and did something I hadn't let myself do in years. I started digging. Old bank statements. Old emails. Timelines I'd never had the emotional bandwidth to examine closely before. The patterns were there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to notice them. But I wasn't equipped for this level of forensic work alone. I needed a professional. I called a forensic accountant I'd been introduced to through one of my investors, a quiet, meticulous man who had a gift for finding entire stories buried inside spreadsheets. I flew him out the next day. We spent 5 hours in that suite, documents spread across the coffee table, while I laid out the whole history for him. My instruction was simple: find everything. Assume nothing is a coincidence. A week later, he called back. His voice was grim. He told me to sit down. What he'd found was worse than anything I'd imagined. And once I heard it, there was no version of the story left where I simply walked away and let it go. My sister's deception hadn't stopped at fake text messages. It had gone far deeper, deep enough to qualify as an actual crime. Using stolen personal information, my social security number, my date of birth, almost certainly lifted from old tax documents kept in our parents' house. She'd applied for a personal loan in my name roughly a month before our relationship fell apart. The loan itself was denied, Thankfully, but the hard credit inquiry had left a mark on my financial history for years without my knowledge. That's identity theft. Plain and simple. He tracked down the original purchase record for the sapphire ring. I'd paid the deposit myself, but the final payment and pickup had been signed for by my sister. She'd forged my signature at the jewelry counter, claiming she was collecting it as a surprise on my behalf. And the most chilling discovery of all, in the days right before the breakup, someone had attempted to open a joint bank account under both my name and his. The application only failed because it required in-person verification from both parties. She hadn't just wanted my relationship. She'd been actively trying to hijack my financial identity, my entire future, piece by piece. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and sat staring out the window at the city below for a very long time. The grief I'd carried for years was gone. In its place was something colder, harder, and completely clear-headed. I called my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I'd consulted with months earlier when I first suspected something wasn't adding up. She'd called the potential evidence nuclear-level leverage back then. Now I told her, flatly, start the paperwork. The game had officially changed. This was no longer family drama. This was accountability. Power, I learned, doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be patient. And for the following weeks, I was very, very patient. While my legal team began drafting the initial filings, karma handed me something I genuinely could not have scripted better myself. One of the smaller companies my firm had quietly acquired months earlier, operating under its own independent name, with my involvement known only to a handful of executives, had an opening for a product lead role. My head of HR forwarded me the shortlist of final round candidates. Third name on the list, my sister. I stared at it and started laughing out loud in an empty office. The universe apparently has a real sense of humor. Her resume was a work of pure fiction, minor roles inflated into sweeping leadership titles, buzzword-stuffed nonsense about synergy and scalability dressing up experience that simply didn't exist. She was applying to be a senior leader inside my own company, my empire, without the faintest idea whose door she was actually knocking on. I sat with that for a while, letting a slow, precise plan take shape. This wasn't going to be an explosion. This was going to be surgical. I told HR I wanted to personally handle her final interview and set it for the following week. I don't think, in her wildest imagination, she could have guessed exactly who was about to walk through that door. I arranged the meeting at one of our newest offices, a converted loft space downtown functioning as an innovation lab, sleek and deliberately anonymous. No company names on the door. No connection to any press coverage of our main brand. Just frosted glass and a quiet security system logging every movement inside. The day of the interview, I sat in a small observation room behind a two-way mirror, sipping black coffee, while two of my top VPs conducted the interview like she was a completely serious candidate. I'd instructed them beforehand, ask her tough questions, make her work for it, but don't reveal a single hint about who was actually behind the company. I watched her walk in. She looked different. Thinner. Faint lines of stress etched around eyes that used to look untouchable. A cheap blazer that didn't sit right on her shoulders. But underneath all that, the old arrogance was still fully intact. She talked and talked, spinning half-truths about brand leadership, casually claiming credit for projects I personally knew she'd never come near. When the interview wrapped, my VPs told her they needed a few minutes to confer and asked her to wait in the lobby. I had them stall her for exactly 15 minutes, just long enough for me to slip upstairs into the corner office with my name etched quietly on the glass door. A soft knock came right on schedule. My assistant opened the door and told her she could go in now. She stepped inside, clutching a cheap folder, an anxious, hopeful smile on her face, clearly expecting some kind of hoodie-wearing tech executive. Instead, she saw me, seated behind the desk, hands calmly folded in front of me. She stopped dead. The folder slipped straight out of her hands, scattering fabricated resumes across the polished floor. I let the silence stretch out for a long, long moment before I said a single word, and when I finally spoke, it wasn't the reaction she was braced for. Her face drained of color completely. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, like she genuinely couldn't locate a single sentence. "Hey," I finally said, leaning back in my chair. "Long time." She stammered something about not realizing this was my company. I told her, calmly, that it was, and then I told her falsely and calmly that I hadn't come here to gloat. That this wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. That seemed to snap a flicker of her old defiance back into place. She started in on the excuses, that things had gotten messy back then, that she'd been jealous, that she never meant for it to go this far, that she'd just been trying to protect him, that she thought. I cut her off, stood up slowly, walked around the desk until I was standing just a few feet away. You weren't protecting anyone, I said. You lied. You forged documents. You committed fraud. You poisoned my relationship, stole my ring, stole my name, and then you wore my life like a coat that never fit you. She started to protest again. I stepped closer, my voice dropping. You know the actual difference between us? You've spent your whole life needing an audience. All I ever needed was time. And you gave me plenty of it. 5 years of silence, 5 years to build something you are never, ever going to touch. She looked like she wanted to bolt, but her feet stayed rooted to the floor. I walked back to my desk and picked up a thick, leather-bound folder. Inside, every piece of evidence Arthur had assembled. The forged loan application. The jewelry store receipt with her fraudulent signature circled in red. A full timeline of her attempts to access my identity, complete with traced IP addresses. I slid it across the desk until it stopped directly in front of her. Originals are in a safe deposit box, I said evenly. And I have the legal team and the resources to drag this through every court in the state for the next decade, if that's what you'd prefer. She stared at the folder like it might bite her. A flicker of desperate hope crossed her face when I added, but I'm not going to do that. Why? She asked, barely audible. I looked past her, out at the skyline. Because that would put you back at the center of the story. And frankly, you're not even worth the ink. I didn't watch her leave. I just told her she could see herself out. No guards. No threats. Just the crushing weight of watching her own choices finally catch up to her. And believe me, what came next was far louder in its consequences than anything I could have said in that room. She left without another word, the office door clicking softly shut behind her, like she was afraid of waking something dangerous. She was right to be careful. It was very much awake. The real reckoning started the next morning. At exactly 9 a.m., a courier delivered a formal notice to my parents' house, not a lawsuit yet, but a formal notice of investigation citing specific statutes tied to identity theft, forgery, and bank fraud. Cold, precise legal language that made one thing unmistakably clear between the lines. We see everything, we can prove it, and we're prepared to use it. As predicted, she panicked and called our mother. By that afternoon, my phone, somehow they'd gotten the new number, was flooded with texts and voicemails. Please to call back. Reminders that this has gone too far. My personal favorite, you're still family. I deleted every single one without listening past the first few words. Because the next phase was already quietly in motion. 2 years earlier, when I'd first learned through my old roommate that my mother was draining her retirement accounts to prop up my sister's collapsing lifestyle, even selling off a small lake property my grandfather had left her, I'd stepped in. Quietly. Legally. Through a third-party wealth advisor operating on behalf of a private trust, I'd offered my mother a deal she couldn't refuse. The trust would purchase a 50% stake in her primary residence, clearing her debts and freeing up cash flow. She signed without ever once asking who was behind the silent partner in that trust. Why would she? As far as she knew, I was still some broken girl licking her wounds somewhere out west. Now, a second legal notice arrived, this time from the firm representing that trust. It informed her that, due to a defaulted clause tied to sheltering an individual under active criminal investigation, a motion was already being filed to liquidate the property. I had just legally pulled the roof out from under all of them. But that still wasn't the final blow. The last domino fell through him. I sent a single, simple message. If he wanted full custody of his son, I could help make that happen. He called within the hour. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our two cities. He looked tired, but the haunted look that had lived in his eyes for years was gone. The first thing he told me was that he didn't want my money. I told him it was never about the money. It was about giving that little boy a stable life, away from all the toxicity he'd been born into. I offered to fund the entire legal fight, connect him with the best family attorney in the state, and set up a college fund to secure his son's future outright. His eyes welled up. He asked why I'd do this for him. I told him the truth. Because he was the only one who'd ever actually told the truth. 2 months later, the custody hearing barely qualified as a fight. My sister showed up alone, unprepared, without real legal representation. He walked out with full, sole custody of his son. She walked out with nothing but the direct consequences of every decision she'd made. And the very last stroke didn't come from a courtroom at all. It came from something far more permanent, a headline. The local paper ran a glowing, full-page feature on my company and its notoriously private founder, a story about resilience, about rebuilding an empire out of nothing but grit and stubbornness. Buried in a small sidebar about my personal history was a single, carefully worded, lawyer-approved paragraph about leaving my hometown after a deep personal betrayal involving financial fraud and identity theft carried out by a close family member. It noted that legal proceedings were already underway. Her name never appeared in that article. It didn't need to. In a town that small, everyone already knew exactly who it meant. The fallout was slow, thorough, and absolutely devastating. Her remaining friends stopped answering her calls. The small freelance jobs that used to keep her afloat quietly dried up overnight. My mother, realizing the house was no longer salvageable, was forced into a rushed sale, unloading it for a fraction of what it was actually worth. She moved into a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the far edge of town, a world away from the garden parties she used to host while bragging endlessly about her perfect daughter. Her social standing didn't collapse all at once. It eroded in 1,000 quiet snubs. I heard from my old roommate that she'd once run into a friend of 30 years at the grocery store, and the woman simply turned her cart around and walked briskly down another aisle. My sister tried to run, relocating to another city after losing custody, after the article, after the house sold out from under her. But the internet doesn't forget. Employers Googled her name and found that article sitting right at the top. Background checks flagged her instantly. One night, my old roommate sent me a screenshot. She'd started an online fundraiser, framing herself as a struggling single mother facing unfair curveballs. A heavily filtered selfie for a profile picture. No mention of me anywhere. No mention of the truth. I didn't donate. Neither, it turned out, did anyone else. After 3 weeks, the total sat at a grand sum of $75. But out of everything that happened after that reunion, one small envelope with no return address is the thing that's actually stayed with me the longest. A few months later, a plain white envelope showed up at my office. No letter inside. No note of any kind. Just a piece of folded construction paper. A crayon drawing. A stick figure with wild, spiky hair and a lopsided grin, holding hands with a taller stick figure in a suit. From my nephew. I pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. Not to remind myself who I'd been to that family, but to remind myself of exactly who I'd managed to become despite them. I don't talk about any of this often. Not to the press, not to my business partners, not even to the people I work with every single day. Because as satisfying as that whole reckoning was, it was never actually my origin story. It was just a footnote. The real story was the years before it, the quiet nights hunched over a laptop teaching myself to code, the failed pitches, the terrifying first hire, the version of me that built something real out of a single suitcase and a burner phone. The real story is that I left with nothing, and I came back with a name that finally carried its own weight. My mother used to warn me I'd regret walking away from my family. What she never understood, and probably still doesn't, is that I never actually walked away from family. I walked away from people who happened to share my last name, but who only ever treated me like a stepping stone, a backup plan, a shadow they could stand in front of whenever it was convenient. And I never once looked back. Not until the day I pulled into that reunion in a car worth more than every dollar my sister had ever earned, dressed in a suit that outclassed her entire wardrobe, and watched from the shade as they limped in late, sweating, humiliated, because their rusted-out minivan had died 2 blocks from the entrance. I stood there with a glass of iced tea in my hand, watching them scan the crowd for me, and I understood something in that exact moment that took me 29 years to finally believe. I wasn't standing in their shadow anymore. They were standing in mine.